But now we are live, so welcome to the Fascia Guide Live with me, Per Johansson, with me, Axel Bodin, and with you, Per Johansson. I'm gonna move us back to so you can see us, and then we can redo this introduction. I hope you are fine with this, the audience, and I hope you, Per, are fine with this as well, that we have to redo this. Maybe we will learn something from it, and it's better the second time around. So we've been streaming now for 8 minutes, and I was like, I can't see that we're live in the YouTube software, so... and then I had to double check, and yeah, we were not live.
Well, we can repeat what we just said more briefly then.
We can, and that's actually probably a good thing. So, welcome. We talked a little bit about November in Sweden. There was some snow in the southern part. There was been darkness here in Stockholm. So that you will never hear us talk about again. So let's go straight into it. We have a main we have a main topic for the Fascia Guide today. We're going to talk about how we understand things, how we learn things, and what we as a society looks at as what do we define as knowledge, and how do we do that, and how does that help us understand things in a different way. And to go on point, we have we're going to base this around the document called Fascia and the Living Body, which is on the Fascia Guide, and this link will be on the front page of the Fascia Guide, so you can easily access it. And here you will find a short animation of about 2 minutes that digs into the living body. How does it look? So it's an animation showing the cell, showing the fascia, showing how everything is in the body. You can look at it after this, but it shows what fascia is, basically. And this document is based on our conclusions after a lot of years in this field, but also around 100 hours of discussions about what fascia could be or is. And in this document, we talked about it in the last live session. We have some basic assumptions about how we understand parts and how we understand the whole as a concept. And also the difference between inner and outer. We talked about it during the last live as well. But what we want to focus on today is the different bases for knowledge and understanding. And we're basically going to cover 3 types of knowledge and understanding. One is the theoretical knowledge, the dominant form of knowledge in our society. Experiential,
Yes, experiential
knowledge. We talked about that a little bit during the last session about how if you have, for example, cooked, if you're a professional chef, you're better at cooking and produce a better meal than if you are an amateur chef, basically, or if you're just a regular person, and how that knowledge is in your body in a different sense. And we touched on the 3rd type of knowledge, the principal understanding, the principal knowledge, and now we're going to talk more about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this section. I think I'm going to read this part over here, and then we can discuss what it actually says. And then I'm going to read the next chunk, and we're going to discuss what that actually says. And the idea is to have a platform for further discussions later on, which will help us understand fascia, the body, society in a different sense. So without further ado, shall I just start reading, and we'll see how it goes? Yeah. So, established scientific research is based on empirical studies, experiments, clinical studies, often so-called double-blind tests, and statistical analysis. And all of this is in relation to some theory. It is also based on a strictly regulated procedure of publication with so-called peer review. The purpose of the latter is that it should be possible to evaluate the studies in a precise way, and if needed, to replicate them in the same form. So this is what the most people understand is science, basically, or what we talk about when we talk about science. Each stage in this process must be carefully documented in writing, and in the end, it's the final published documentation, the scientific papers, that become the criterion for what is scientific. The as a rule great significance on statistical methods means there's a focus on empirically accessible matters which easily precludes a focus on individuals as such. Science is first and foremost interested in what is universally the case, not in what is specific and unique. This science has led to an advanced understanding of parts, occurrences in the outer world, functions and correlations, and understanding which deliberately doesn't take ethical or cultural values into account, how things feel, or their philosophical meaning. As a consequence, scientific publications lack subjective content, which strengthens the separation of inner and outer, and hence makes an understanding of the living body as a whole impossible. Okay, so rewinding a little bit. What we're basically saying here is that science in itself shouldn't take ethical or cultural values into account. It shouldn't focus on how things feel. It shouldn't focus on what this means in a philosophical sense, and it's in a sense objective, right? That's like the purpose of it.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand here that these characteristics, briefly enumerated here about the characteristics of science, applies really strictly only to the publication, to the published scientific papers. The scientific work as such, what researchers do all day, is often a mess and involves all kinds of experiential knowledge and subjective motivations and all kinds of difficulties. So the science does not really, this, if you speak of scientific results, this science doesn't really reside primarily in the scientists, but only in the publications. And the format of publication is very strict. And good scientists have internalized this this specific kind of objectivity sufficiently that they are able also in their daily work to some extent to exclude subjective factors. So the point here is that there's a difference between what scientists do and how scientists as human beings think and the actual results, because the actual results only exist in the published papers. And the published papers, especially in the natural sciences, follow a very, very strict format in which you first state your assumptions and what questions you're trying to ask, and then you describe your methods, and third, you describe the results, which is the core of the paper, the results. And then follows often, or usually, a brief discussion, which for the mostly relates to other research in the same field. So, and the language here is extremely dry, and if you're not into it, so to speak, you probably find it extremely boring as well, if not incomprehensible. So the important point here is that science exists in this published form, and if you're going to think more deeply about this, you have to separate the scientists and the everyday world of scientists and scientific institutions. You will have to separate the living aspects of this from the results, which only exist in this written form.
And I'm thinking also of, like, why are we bringing this up? Why are we talking about this subject? Why are we talking about the subject? So, just to explain it, it's like we want to bring into mind the difference about talking about this that you see on the screen now and talking about this. So, but to understand why this is not the same as this, we want to break down how this way of thinking has affected everything around us. Because it's not just that, okay, this is a way of thinking. It's also the dominant way of thinking in our Western culture, right?
Yes, it's a way of thinking which focuses on the so-called objective world, the world we can think about as being separate from ourselves and completely outside ourselves, the world which we assume exists totally independently of our subjectivity, of our experience. And this is what is reflected in the scientific language, in scientific publications. Uh, there's also another aspect which might be more difficult to grasp, and that is um, the, really the kind of reasoning here is based on conceptual thinking. Uh, this might lead to difficulty when you study living things, because characteristic of everything that is alive and is that it's always changing and moving and interacting with all kinds of other things and forms of life. So and it's very difficult to capture this living, changing, interacting quality of actual life. It's difficult to capture this in the language of science, which is conceptual and not very, well, it doesn't move, you can say. It's not very pliable in itself. It's very clearly defined, everything, which means that to my, if I put in some of my own thoughts here, is that to me this means that science can really only study in its customary way things that do not change too much too quickly and do not interact too much with too much other things. So there's a necessity also in science of this kind to reduce what one focuses upon. Hence the increased specialization nowadays, almost exponentially increasing specialization, because it's more and more detail all the time.
That's why I thought it was an idea to actually bring up the footage of a living tissue while we have this very dead text next to it, just to show the difference between the moving and the still. But
of
as
course,
a
I must add that of course the scientists themselves know this. So this is a rather this is an aspect of science which really isn't discussed very much. It's you could almost call it its rhetorical quality. So science makes it seem that the world is much more clear cut than it actually is, and which means that only some things can be well understood scientifically in detail in this very strict way, but other things perhaps cannot be understood at all within this kind of methods and thinking. A somewhat controversial statement, but I think it's actually true.
and it's it was a great quote by Neil Teese from Berlin in 2018, where he said, I'm studying the body under a microscope all day, and we pretend it's a living thing, but it's not. Like it's studying. You're studying things, and you pretend that it studies 2D, two-dimensional, but it pretends it's three-dimensional, but it's not. So it's like there is a let's stop a little bit with objectivity, because that's like one of the points here, is that it lacks subjective content. But is there subjectivity in a sense, or is there objectivity? Like, because I'm always bringing in my subjectivity into something. What happens when you take away?
Philosophically speaking, it's if you if you really mean that the world as an object outside all subjectivity actually exists, then you run into all sorts of philosophical problems. But this doesn't really concern the scientific work as such, because as Neil Teese apparently said, then you pretend that you look at the world, or you learn to look or frame, I would say, frame the world in a certain way, and that's it. Within this framing of the so-called objective world, you conduct your research, and you put brackets around yourself and all other subjects. So what this means is that science is actually a wholly, very, or perhaps totally artificial endeavor. It's a construction, which does not mean that it doesn't say anything about reality or what it actually exists and how things work. It does say certain things about this. There is an interaction. The scientific process is, as such, includes empirical observations and experiments. So there's always a dialogue in science between what is supposed to be an outer world and what is supposed to be an inner world. That is the thinking, the scientific thinking process. So science is not artificial in that it's a free construction. That it isn't. It's a very elaborate dialogical construction, but it is when published and results when results are published, it is an artificial product. It's a product of certain assumptions and a certain way of looking at the world. The strange thing, one might think, is that it actually can say something about what can also be experienced. So there are lots of deep philosophical questions hiding here. But the basic thing for us now is to realize that what science in this form does is it distances itself from us, and hence it distances us from the world.
But to simplify it, could you say that, or is it false to say that we get a lot of valuable insights from science, but never the whole truth?
Well, I'm not sure we're getting any insights, but we get very useful knowledge. And the philosophical difficulty is what this knowledge actually means in relation to other kinds of knowledge, which we will speak about, especially experiential knowledge.
But that's like, because in a lot of forums or a lot of conversations, you kind of say that science is equal to truth. You kind of put them on the same. The science is truth, basically.
Yes, but that
and
presupposes a specific concept of truth. I don't think we shall elaborate on that right now, because
that's another topic for another day.
Perhaps half an hour at least. But when we speak about scientific truth, it is truth. What is meant by truth then is very different from what we mean by truth in everyday life, because scientific truth is a constructed, theoretically constructed and artificially constructed kind of truth. Which is the reason why science is quite hard, actually.
But for the sake of our conversation, why we are here and why we're talking about this is because the Fascia research is done in this same way that we went through up here, like the same.
Yes,
it follows
absolutely.
the same processes. It follows the same scientific papers, the statistical methods, the empirical accessible matter. It follows the same methods, but the problem is that it also raises new types of questions, because we get a deeper understanding of different parts and occurrences or functions or correlations, but because the fascia doesn't care about we can actually read from here. What makes the understanding of the fascia special is that the fascia so clearly doesn't care about the customer division of the body into different parts. Like it's everywhere at the same time. And this has forced fascia research to become aware of the whole more than of the part as such, which can be difficult, if not impossible, within the reigning research paradigm.
Yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. This means what this means is that scientific fascia research follows the same principles as every other kind of medical and biological scientific research, which means that it's really based on a rather reductive procedures and conceptualizations. What is interesting then is that by these means, one has, as I understand it, one has begun to realize that. Sorry, there's things happening on my screen which distracts me. Fascia researchers, as I understand it, seem to have realized that even though their results have been arrived at in this usual scientific manner, they point to they run into difficulties. If fascia is distributed throughout the body, and if fascia in some way seems to integrate or have something to do with what happens in distant parts of the body, then it's very difficult to conceptualize how this can happen, how this occurs, because the scientific thinking is reductive at its base. And if scientific research then leads you to conclude scientifically that we have to understand how the whole works here, then there exist ways of thinking within science, or very new ways of thinking within science, which tries to conceptualize wholeness, various kinds of complexity theory, for instance. Well, I think philosophically speaking, you can say that fascia is one field of research which has run into a paradox which follows from the method itself, really.
mm. Actually, I could quote. I had an email conversation with Jean-Charles Guimberteau, the surgeon responsible for the footage we see here on the right. And he said he was very happy that we wrote about the living body, and he said this is the struggle he's been fighting for years, showing conference by conference, films by films, the living matter as it is through my endoscopic explorations in vivo on living patients. So he's shown footage of actual alive people on conference after conference, and what his conclusion that he told me was, the perception and study of the living matter cannot be achieved by observing only the dead. Our body has a globalized fibrillar architecture from scale to scale, mobile, adaptive, perfused by flows, and only by observing the living can this be highlighted, revealed, and understood. And this is the important thing. This changes paradigms and opens up an unexpected scientific world. Our academic and traditional ways of thinking could be obsolete.
Yes.
We now have
Exactly.
the technological capabilities to do differently, but established thinking moves slowly. And that is, it's a realization after studying filming the living body for years, is that everything we know might need to be challenged, and that's exciting, I think, in a way. And what we write here in this document is that the consequences of the separation into inner and outer are even worse, because the fascia system can be influenced in many different ways, and some important influences, for example, emotional traumas or strong habits, are clearly inner things, while simultaneously having immediate outer effects on the physical structure, on the function of the fascia. This fact is not sufficiently accessible and of use to objective scientific methods, not least because individual variations and constant changes is so relevant on how living fascia behaves. as example of this, to be on a live stream in front of people like we are right now, if you put 100 people into this situation, they will react differently. Some will be stressed, some will stutter, some will be nervous, some will be extremely um, well formulated or relaxed, or it's the same situation can affect us in so many different ways, depending on who we are. And that's really hard to study in this way that we read up here. It's really
Which
hard to
means
take into
actually
account.
that what your example here means that it is never actually the same situation, because
No.
it's a different situation depending on who is in it, so to speak. And this is exactly what you cannot get at with ordinary scientific methods. What you can do scientifically is you can make a study of 100 participants, different participants in a sequentially in a live stream, and then you can measure certain things and observe certain constants, and you can do a mathematical analysis of these measurements, and you can say that generally speaking, most people at 62% of the time do this or that. And this, of course, is a kind of knowledge, and this is the objective knowledge which you can get out of that kind of study, but you cannot touch in that paradigm. You cannot touch what people actually experience, and what people actually experience is what affects what they actually do. So this is I would say that it is what actually happens is in this sense inaccessible to science as it's ordinarily pursued.
and and at the same time, it's one of the core fundamental experience of being alive is that
Of
you can
course.
do almost the same thing. You can listen to the same song or be with the same person, but during a different day or a different weather or a different time of year or a different during different circumstances, the experience is completely another. So
And that's
this
why
is
I
like
say that said
yeah.
earlier that science is a construct, is an artificial construction, because what you can get at and formulate in scientific terms cannot, as such, as formulated in this way, cannot be experienced. And that's why it is objective, but it's objective then in a very clearly defined
Mm.
sense, which is rather remote from how life actually feels.
So what can we do then? And that's the next important or interesting part of this. So to summarize it, the sum of all kinds of influences on the fascia, together with the sum of all individual variations in themselves changing, demands an understanding of the whole based on principle and explanations grounded in a holistic perspective. This kind of understanding and explanation cannot arrive by means of putting together one's understanding of the parts. It demands a change of perspective. This does not contradict the importance of specialized understanding. It means that the specialized understanding is insufficient. So, knowledge of the interaction between inner and outer, of the wholeness which orders the parts, and of how the whole can be influenced in an orderly and knowledgeable manner, largely arises in actual therapy situations, regardless of whether it's a visit to a doctor, a conversational therapy, or manual treatment. An essential part of knowledge thus lives primarily in the therapist in the form of experientially based abilities of discernment and judgment, simultaneously related to the individual centered on the whole in different situations. Let me give an example to explain what we just said here. So, when I was 20 years old, we had a clinic in the central part of Stockholm, and I was not a therapist, so I had more flexible schedule, which meant that during lunch hours, when people had their time off, they came to our clinic and did what we called a picture diagnosis. So we took pictures of posture and balance. And we took a picture of how they looked, and then we had it on a big screen in our room, and we looked at this screen and explained posture to them, like what do we see here, and how do you look there, and how is your head, how is your your shoulders, how is your pelvis, and so on. And I, at the first, I was a little bit uncomfortable with it, but then we were at an exhibition and we did 1,200 of these in 3 days. And when you do something 1,300 times or 1,200 times in a short, then it kind of becomes habitual. Like it's impossible to do something so many times without finding quicker ways to do it, more efficient way to do it. So since that weekend, I've been able to, um, or I've been cursed with the ability to see how someone to see posture and balance, which means that I see it on every time I watch athletes, every time I watch the TV, every time I take the subway, every time I move. If I look out of my office right now, I see a square with 100 people, and I can look at, okay, that one has a problem in her knee, that one has a problem in. So it's not it's knowledge that lives inside of me because of things I've been through, because I have seen so many different type of bodies and examined in so many different type of ways where if they have this type of posture, what kind of pain do they have, or where are they tense. And we've been doing this for 14 years, so it's kind of in there. And that's what we mean with the knowledge actually lives inside the therapist. And it's the same thing with a medical doctor who just knows what to prescribe in a certain situation, or just sometimes they look it up, sometimes they have to ask a colleague, but most of the time, someone who has worked with something for a long time knows what should be done in a certain type of situation. And that's the experiential knowledge we talk about. What's interesting here is that, so if someone comes to our clinics, they fill out a journal or a health form. And when they do that, they say a lot of things about their history, what they've been through. But then they walk in, and then you see other things because you see something with their posture. You learn what type of questions you should answer to um, get them to say what they really, to bring out what's really interesting about their history. And from that meeting, you can get a very good, not a total, not like a complete picture, but a good picture of an individual person. And I think that's the key, that you can, we as human beings has the capacity to analyze a lot of data points, both theoretical, both visual, both from words that people say, from words that are written, from movements, from the energy that's being put out. It's so we can analyze so many different data points at the same time, and the more we do that, with the more experience we have, we can draw upon experience as well, and that's kind of amazing, right, Per?
Yes, as human beings, we are very good at how shall I put it, at acquiring knowledge in this way. And this is, of course, the basic way of acquiring knowledge in whatever you do. This actually applies to scientific work as well, because behind this very dry, objective scientific paper, there's a lot of experience within the researchers. It's not that the scientific endeavor generally is a dry affair. It is the published results that are dry in a certain way and very objective and strict. And this, I think, is the interesting point here so far, is that we put a very great value on, and sometimes or often premium on scientific knowledge. And if we know what we're talking about, then this knowledge consists of all these published scientific papers and books. And because we value this kind of knowledge so highly, we tend to overlook what it really can't do. Scientific knowledge as such cannot produce the kind of experiential knowledge you just described. You cannot read a book or do a scientific experiment in order to acquire that kind of knowledge. The kind of experiential knowledge you acquire when you do a scientific experiment is how to do a scientific experiment, not how to treat a patient as a person. So, and this, of course, is in certain ways, this to most people, I think, is also to scientists, is quite self-evident. But the strange thing that our culture, our how we speak about things, how we value various kinds of knowledge, does not reflect this self-evidentness. This is really strange, actually, and deserves a study of its own. We do things and we value things which cannot produce what the kind of knowledge we also need. And we cannot formulate, we cannot grasp the experiential knowledge as a therapist, for instance. This cannot be grasped and formulated in scientific terms. Hence, we tend to, collectively at least, tend to think of it as of less importance or less truth value.
Yeah, I would say that. So we talked a little bit about experiential knowledge, a lot about theoretical knowledge, and very little about principled knowledge yet. But I think if you look at this like as three pillars with the same weight, the same attention, the same, that would be different. But now it's like the theoretical knowledge pillar is perhaps like 90% of the conversation, and then the other two are left with the other 10. So it's a domination of that kind of thinking in our culture and what we value, but as people in our own life, this is more like everyday, like in our everyday life, we don't really want the scientific papers to tell us what we should do. It's more based on experience and principles, or what people are doing around us. It's like in our lives, it's not as important, but in our decision making, in our culture, in our structure of society, we focus a lot on that kind of knowledge.
And this I think is why understanding of principles is important, because in a certain sense, awareness of very basic principles can help to build a bridge in your own thinking between scientific or theoretical knowledge and experiential knowledge, because the principles apply both ways, so to speak.
Okay, but let's move ahead
look at some principles.
Okay, yeah. So, in this living knowledge, there's also methodological aspects, but it isn't as easy to reproduce and test via peer-reviewed publication. It isn't less valid as a knowledge, especially not therapeutically, but it cannot be captured as clear in text. This form of experience-based knowledge is conveyed and gets its reproducible validity by means of direct personal context and exchanges between practitioners. It can be likened to an advanced and qualitative craftsmanship. What's special about the kind of knowledge, this kind of knowledge development and understanding that the fascia system demands, is that it needs to find ways for these two modes of knowledge to harmonize in different ways, without blurring their unique characteristics. The understanding of the whole, which becomes necessary in relation to fascia, can never be reduced to only which is accessible to conventional scientific methodology. The living human being must be deliberate and explicitly present in one's actual understanding. Consequently, this desirable understanding becomes more personally demanding, both in theory and practice, interactively, than a solely scientific or solely experience-based understanding. And here is here the principal understanding of things enter. So you have these two ways of looking at things. You have the experiential knowledge, and then you have the theoretical knowledge. What's interesting with the principle knowledge is that it kind of works in both fashions. And I think one example we can start with that's gonna help people understand what a principle is or could be is the one we talked about. I think we mentioned it last time, but it's the um, by overcoming a challenge, I become stronger. Could be formulated like that. But like if you overcome a challenge, you become a stronger person. But it's also if you as a um, if the immune system overcomes a challenge, it becomes stronger. Or if in nature you see the same things. If something in nature overcomes a challenge, it becomes stronger. So that could be a principle, right?
Yes, and principles in this sense then do not the distinction between the objective and subjective reality is doesn't apply really, because you can apply principles objectively, and you can also apply them subjectively, and it's actually the same principle when you think about things. So yeah,
Do you have another example of a principle that's
we had a list, didn't we?
yeah?
Can you find the list?
I can
think
find the
that will
list.
be easier.
Um, maybe I should even bring it up. Well, one we talked about last time is that life is movement.
Yes, we already mentioned that. Definitely, and that is yes, which makes a strict scientific approach difficult, as we've begun to see in the understanding of fascia. But it's equally apparent in other fields of knowledge. I remember one biologist I spoke to many years ago. We talked about this problem, and he said simply how to present a scientific understanding of this principle. It should be a movie, I think. And he meant that very seriously. And this, of course, is the value of Jean-Claude Guimberteau's work as a filmmaker, because you can see how it moves. And if you've seen how it moves, you understand in a second that the textbook illustrations of some tissue are really static representations of a conceptual view of a dead body.
But we could start actually just to hammer this down, or to, I don't know if you say that in English, hammer this down. But the ones we talk about in the living body is how life is flow. Like the more flow you have, the more life you have. And that flow in itself is creating the structure. And then
And this is also the very scientific definition of life. Life appears when you have a flow of energy through a living body. So flow, without flows of energy and materials, you cannot have life in any form.
And then that water is central to all life. So each living cell or organism has a flow of water. And all life requires water.
Speaking of principles being useful both for scientific understanding and for experiential understanding, I think flow is a very good example, because you cannot understand things scientifically in an adequate manner if you're not aware of flow in one way or another. And you cannot feel your own body, how it works and what affects it, without being aware of flow within yourself, various flows. So flow as a principle goes very deep, actually.
Yeah, and maybe we should as a conclusion to this episode and this discussion, talk about a principled way of approaching life, because that's something both you and I have used a lot in the last. For me, it's been around, let's say, 5 years, which I've been aware of it. But before that, even more years, probably half my life at least. And you've been doing this for a long time as well, like thinking in terms of principles when you approach things in life. And one of those, for example, is that flow is so all life requires flow, which means that flow is um, the more flow, the more life. Like the more
Right.
alive you are, the more flow, the more alive, the more flow, the more flow, the more alive. So flow is a way to be alive. So if you are in flow, if you're inspired, if you're in that state of mind, you do things differently. And one example of this is when if you're in the right state of mind, time changes. You experience time in a different way. You get more things done, or you do less things, but it's the right things. And by doing those things, you save a lot of time. So, um, and that's another principle that's perhaps then not true. That um, the more you work, the better result. It could also be less work brings more result if you have flow. So it's thinking in these terms of what is the perhaps asking what is the fundamental principle or fundamental truth about this situation has helped me a lot, at least figuring out what to do with things.
Yes, and now you have described it quite adequately in subjective terms or terms of experience, how it feels. Uh, but given then the knowledge that the feeling of flow or the feeling of not flow, the feeling of rigidity, for example, it directly affects and can, I think, also be measured in living fascia. So fascia, we think about fascia as something, when we study fascia scientifically, or we think about fascia as part of a body, we think about it as a feature of the body, as an organ in the body, as an objective thing, or an objective phenomenon. But but exactly the same. The principle of flow then applies to the fascia as an objective occurrence just as much as it applies to our experience of how it feels to be alive, more or less alive, more or less flowing, more or less rigid. So I think this is a good example of how a principle like flow cuts both ways. It
And
applies
it
to
and
the
it also
objective world and to the
yeah,
subjective world simultaneously.
and it also affects. It also has an effect on everything around it. So for example, um, if I um, if I breathe and move, if I walk my dog every morning. So by walking my dog, my the flow of my body starts. Like that walking actually increases the flow inside of my physical body. And then I breathe, like deep breath, which also affects the flow inside of my body, which also is also a flow of air, which also is a flow of oxygen that goes out through my blood, which is also flow to my cells. So I'm more energized, and this is both in an anatomical, physiological way, but also in a sense of me doing something, breathing. But I'm also breathing. I'm having a moment to myself, a moment of meditation, or a moment of calmness, and then I talk to someone in that state of mind, and because I am calm and I have my flow going, I talk to them in a different sense, which might affect them. We get into a different sense of we have a different type of exchange, which then inspires us or inspire me, and then I'm in a different sense of mind because I'm inspired. And if I then show up to a meeting and I am full of energy, I'm full of flow, I'm full of life. If I show up to a meeting alive, what happens to the other people in that same meeting? Well, they have to respond. It's hard to be, if I am alive and I talk to you, it's hard for you to be dead and respond. Like you kind of have to react in some way, which means that the whole
Or
meeting
I become
changes.
irritated and say, "Don't wake me up." Don't.
Yeah, that can also be a thing. But then the whole meeting changes, the atmosphere of the whole meeting changes. And if this is a business meeting because I run a business, then the the level of discussions are increased and productivity increases just from our state of minds, which comes from
Absolutely.
understanding the flow, which comes from me understanding the flow of my physical body. So and that could change someone's day because they were tired or they didn't get their coffee or there was traffic or there was problems at home or wherever, but then they come into this meeting and they get the energy from that meeting, and that in itself changes how they run so it's we are so extremely connected and easily
Also,
affected by these principles.
yes, extremely sensitive to flows in this way, and and of course this is what makes fascia as an organ of the body so interesting, because it reacts immediately to the various kinds of flow, and as we spoke about last time, pressure, because pressure induces or hinders flow in certain ways.
Yeah, and that's the so we also talked about like fabric fascia of the fabric of life. You can read more in this article, but how the flow creates a structure and the structure affects the flow, and the principles that we talked about briefly, that we actually become what we do. So the way I'm sitting, the way I'm moving, the way I use my body actually tells my body how it should be used. So if I sit in a certain way every day, my body will say, "Oh, you want to sit like that? Then I will rebuild myself to make this easier for you." And if I do push-ups every day, it will say, "Oh, you want to do push-ups every day? I will adjust myself so that you can manage this in an easier sense." If you think of your body as um,
A partner.
a partner or a servant, basically.
Mm.
So you want to do this? Let me make it easier for you, because it's always about making it easier for you, basically. Like it's easier to do if I do push-ups every day. It's easier if I strengthen my muscles. That will make it easier. And the body like,
And that
okay,
is
yeah,
what the body will do for you.
yeah. So there might be a new principle here about the body wants to, but we actually had it up here somewhere, I think. There is, the body wants to,
It's very friendly and obedient. But if you
yeah,
want
here.
it to do things, well, okay, yes.
So each cell, so this is how the body communicates. Each cell must know what the other cells do and also what happens in the environment outside. They have a mutual interest in cooperating and keeping the whole organism alive with the least possible expenditure of energy. This is important. Like the body wants to do things with the least possible expenditure of energy, and this is a base principle of survival. Like this is how we have um, evolutionary developed to survive in tough circumstances. And if there's something we know about human beings is that we can practically survive anywhere under any circumstance. We are extremely adaptable as a species. But it's a lot to, and there is a story about why we are walking on two legs instead of four legs, or like monkeys, they use their arms when they walk as well. So they're not walking on four legs, but they're almost walking on four legs, and that is the amount of energy spent walking on two legs is I think it was 30 times lower or something than if we were like monkeys moving with our whole body with each step. And this is because we had to walk such long distances to get food. It was really good for us to be up straight. So we have like an evolutionary history of spending as little energy as possible.
As has all other organisms.
Yes,
as well.
of course.
So
So,
each in its own way. This is basic, of course, to evolutionary thinking.
but understanding this in your everyday life, that my body actually does what I, in the same way you become what you eat, like what you eat is actually the building blocks that builds up your body. Your body consists of different types of material, and that material comes from what you're eating. So you practically are the hamburger you ate last week. I had pasta for lunch, and now that's a part of me. And I think when focusing on this, it puts a more serious but also playful and fundamental perspective on life. Like if you actually become what you eat, then you think more about what you're eating. If you become what you do, you are more aware of how you're moving. And if you start to experience how it feels to move, or how it feels to eat, or how it feels to think a certain type of thought, or feel a certain type of feeling, how does it feel in your body to be scared? How does it feel in your body to be worried? Do you have to be scared or worried, or can you do something else? Because to be worried, for example, it's you spend a lot of energy if you're worried, and that kind of goes against the core principle of the body, trying to spend as little energy as possible.
Yeah, the interesting things about these principles is that they're extremely easy to
Mm.
understand, to the point of being self-evident. And I know that some people, even if you mention these kinds of principles to some people, they can get irritated because, oh, I know this, of course,
Yeah, or
it's
roll their eyes
self-evident.
like, yeah.
And the point is to stay with the self-evident uh, long enough to grasp its fundamental import in your very life. And we're not, for some reason, we are not used to doing that. We nod our heads and said, yes, I know, of course, what I eat becomes my body. Of course, I know that. But do you really think about that every meal? Do you really think about how it relates to how you feel 3 hours later? And so
And that is the key. Like, do you do it every time, with every meal, with every breath, with every, and the obvious answer is no. Like, probably no
and
one.
it's not so much thinking about it. It's being aware of these principles.
But it can also be, for example, something I have noticed is that if I do something then that goes against my core principles, or that's against what I flow or life or what I value and stuff, I feel it, and then I have the chance to do something about it. And this works really good in well in relations. Like if I have a bad day or a bad moment and I'm mean to someone, or I say something hurtful, I can feel it, and then I can go back and say I'm sorry. And or if I do something that hurts myself, I can be aware of it, go back and say I'm sorry. And I think that's a it's never about being perfect, but it's about being aware, and how you can improve and become better, in a sense, because the more you do something, the easier it gets. Maybe that's another principle, Per. The more you do something, the easier it gets.
Well, to sum up, I think the beautiful thing about this in relation to fascia and the results of fascia research and experience of fascia treatment, the beautiful thing is that uh, now we seem to have a scientific basis for these kinds of experiential reflections which you just made. I think this is why the increasing understanding of fascia and the role of fascia in the living body will actually very much both provoke and facilitate a shift in also in scientific thinking about the living body, which makes it come closer to what we actually experience. So, from my perspective, this is the main interest in fascia knowledge. This potential for bridging all kinds of what we have thought of as philosophical difficulties, but which are really much more actual and concrete, and it's not a matter of thought. It's a matter of experience, actually.
Yeah, and why is this important? Well, we have an old episode talking about that, but I think in order for things to change in our society, in the Western culture, if things are to be different, some would say better, some would say, but I would say if things are to change for the better, we probably need a common ground, like a common basis for understanding things, or a common way to speak, or a way to communicate so that we know what we're talking about. So it's not, oh, this is just your feelings, or this is just your opinion. No, this is something else. This is something based on, if we can talk about core principles of life when we decide how to build an infrastructure road network, for example, or when we decide to build a new block of houses. And if we can have core principles of life in those conversations, we will probably build things differently. If we have core principles of life when we decide on policies for, I don't know, how to construct a new bill, or how to build a new economic system, or whatever, if we use these core principles, we might build them in a different way. And that's what excites me, and that's why I think it's important to talk about this in this way. And that's why Fascia is exciting, because it forces us to look at things in this way.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
I
Okay.
also look forward to the day when you can publish scientific results in the form of a movie
Yeah, that would be interesting.
as part of the publication.
Yeah. Okay. Before we end, something I forgot to do last time. So, on the Fascia guide, you find this article, Fascia and the Living Body. Everything we talked about is put in text here. There are videos explaining it. There are, I think there's a podcast episode here as well. No, it's a text about it. But on the Fascia guide, you can also find the podcast and the movie. And in this podcast, we have episodes about why we talk about fascia, what fascia is, what fascia does, why fascia is not mainstream yet, why we're thinking the way we're thinking about the body, why it's hard for fascia to become mainstream, what flow is. So if you haven't checked out these episodes, if you like this, you definitely like these. And there's also the fascia documentary that you can look at here. And you find everything on the Fascia guide. Actually, this is where you sign up to get it. There's a link where you can actually see it straight away. You can actually see it on YouTube as well, on this YouTube channel. Documentary. Oh, that's not the link. Anyways, it's on there. You can sign up and get it. And there are more things you can do with this. If you want to support us, you can you can visit fasciaguide.com/donate, or you can leave a super chat here on YouTube, or you can do anything with it. We will continue anyway, but every contribution is nice. Yeah, and we will please send ideas on what we should talk about to live@fascia.com. Let us know if there's anything you give us your feedback. It's interesting to see, like, is this even fun? Do you like it?
Or don't.
Or don't. And next week we'll see what we talk about, and the week after that we probably have a guest. So looking forward to that. This time I will finish the stream and not let it roll like I did last time. But I'm wishing you all a great week. Take care. Bye. Nu är den avslutad.
Är du säker på det?